The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, and Winifred Merritt read it 3 times before the words finally settled into her bones like cold water seeping through cracked earth. Her sister Clara was dead, found in the scrubland outside a small cattle town called Harrow's Creek, New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1883. No more details, no explanation, no justice offered or even promised. Just a terse, formal notification from the local sheriff's office, 11 words long, as though Clara's entire 22 years of living could be summed up and dispatched in the time it took a telegrapher to finish his morning coffee. Winifred stood in her small boarding house room in Denver, the yellow paper trembling between her fingers, and she did not weep. Not yet. She had been the older sister, the steadier one, the one who kept her chin level when their father drank and their mother faded, and the world showed its sharpest teeth. She had sent Clara West 8 months ago with a trunk full of good dresses and a letter of introduction to a schoolteacher position in Harrow's Creek, because Clara had wanted to see the wide open country, and Winifred had believed, truly believed, that the open country would be good to her. She folded the telegram into a careful square, tucked it into the pocket of her traveling coat, and began packing. It took her 4 days to reach Harrow's Creek. The final leg was a rattling stagecoach ride across terrain so dry and vast that it seemed to swallow the horizon whole. Red rock formations rose like ancient cathedrals against a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and the dust came in through every crack and gap in the coach until Winifred's dark hair was pale with it, and her eyes were permanently narrowed against the glare. She was 26 years old, lean and capable, with serious gray eyes that people often mistook for coldness until they saw her smile, which was warm and rare and genuine. She was not smiling now. Harrow's Creek turned out to be a town of perhaps 300 souls strung along a single main street of packed dirt and sun-bleached storefronts. There was a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Desert Rose, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a sheriff's office with iron bars on its single window. Winifred climbed down from the stagecoach with her carpet bag in one hand and her jaw set like flint, and she walked directly to the sheriff's office without stopping to arrange her hair or brush the dust from her coat. Sheriff Tom Pruitt was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a rust-colored mustache and tired eyes. He stood when she entered, which she noted with mild surprise, and he held his hat in his hands and told her that he was sorry for her loss in a tone that suggested he meant it at least partly. "I want to know everything," Winifred said, sitting down in the chair across from his desk without waiting to be invited. "I want to know how she died, where she was found, and what you have done about it." Pruitt sat back down slowly, as a man does when he is preparing himself for a conversation he has been dreading. "Miss Merritt," he began. "Everything," she repeated. He told her what he knew. Clara had last been seen on a Friday evening in late March, leaving the schoolhouse after a late evening of grading papers. She had been found the following Sunday morning in the scrubland about 1.5 miles east of town, near the dry creek bed that gave the town its name. She had fallen from her horse. That was the determination. Her neck was broken. The horse had been recovered wandering along the ridge road. There were no signs of foul play that Pruitt could point to definitively, though he admitted that the location struck him as odd. Clara's boarding house was in the other direction entirely. "Who found her?" Winifred asked. Pruitt paused just a fraction of a second too long. "That would be Benjamin Cooper. He runs a small horse ranch about 2 miles east of town. He was out before dawn checking his fence line after some cattle had been spooked through it. He found her in the creek bed and brought her in himself." "I want to speak with him. Miss Merritt, I don't think." "I'm not asking for your opinion on what you think I should do," she said quietly, and her voice had that quality her father used to call her schoolteacher voice, even though she had never been a schoolteacher. It was the voice that said the conversation had only one possible direction. "I am asking you to tell me how to find Benjamin Cooper's ranch." Pruitt gave her directions. She found a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Alcott, who fed her a dinner of salt beef and beans and asked no questions, which Winifred appreciated enormously. She ate quickly and deliberately, the way she had learned to eat in the lean years of her childhood, and then she sat by the narrow window and watched the main street of Harrow's Creek go quiet as the stars came out one by one above the desert. Clara had walked on this street, had looked up at these same stars, had thought about her future with the particular hopefulness of a 22-year-old woman who believed the world was still capable of being navigated by goodness and intelligence and a willingness to work hard. And then something had happened, something that ended in a dry creek bed 1.5 miles in the wrong direction, and nobody in this small, sun-scorched town seemed to feel any particular urgency about understanding what that something was. Winifred pressed her palm flat against the cool glass of the window and made her sister a silent promise. She rode out to Benjamin Cooper's ranch the next morning, borrowing a horse from the livery stable, a steady bay mare with a white blaze who tolerated Winifred's moderately competent horsemanship with evident patience. The land east of town was rough and beautiful in the way that the New Mexico territory had of being beautiful, all red dirt and sage, and the occasional eruption of yellow wildflowers that seemed defiant against the aridity. The sky was enormous and pale blue, and a hawk turned slow circles above the ridge in the still morning air. She found the ranch by following Pruett's directions, and also by following the sight of a man mending fence along the property line. He was tall and broad-shouldered, working with his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the morning chill, and he moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had spent a great deal of his life doing physical work outdoors. He wore a battered brown hat pushed back on his head, and when he heard the horse approaching he straightened and turned to look at her with eyes so dark they were nearly black at this distance. Benjamin Cooper was 31 years old, though he looked both older and younger than that depending on the light and the angle. His face was the face of the territory itself in some ways, weathered and serious and marked by sun and wind, but with a quality of stillness about it that was not coldness. It was the stillness of a man who had learned to carry something heavy and had decided that the only dignified way to do it was quietly. He had been carrying Clara's weight for nearly 2 months. He watched the woman ride up to his fence line and he knew, before she spoke a word, who she was. The gray eyes were the same. The set of the jaw was the same. He had looked at Clara Merritt's face in that dry creek bed in the gray light before dawn, and something about this woman's face reached into that memory and pulled it forward with a force that made his chest tighten. He took off his hat. "You must be her sister," he said. Winifred stopped the horse just on the other side of the fence and looked at him steadily. "I am Winifred Merritt. You are Benjamin Cooper." "Yes, ma'am." "You found my sister." "Yes, ma'am." His voice was low and level and held no defensiveness, which she had been prepared to meet and found herself slightly disarmed not to find. "I have been wondering when someone from her family would come. Tell me exactly what you found, not what the sheriff reported, what you actually found in your own words from the beginning." He looked at her for a moment with those dark, serious eyes, and then he nodded once and hooked his fence tool through his belt and gestured toward the gate a few yards down the line. "Come inside," he said. "There is coffee at the house. This is not a short conversation." The house was modest and clean in the way that a careful man's home is clean, not pristine but orderly, with a clear sense of everything having its purpose and its place. There was a stone fireplace with a low fire burning against the morning chill, a rough-hewn table with 4 chairs, shelves holding a modest collection of books alongside the practical necessities of ranch life, and windows facing east and west that let the morning light flood through in long gold columns. Winifred sat at the table and Benjamin Cooper poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the iron stove without asking how she took it, and set both cups on the table and sat down across from her with the directness of a man who did not waste time on performance. "I want you to understand something first," he said. What I am going to tell you is what I know and what I suspect, and I am going to be clear about which is which. I told the sheriff everything I told you I will tell you, and I do not know why nothing more came of it. Tell me, Winifred said. He told her. He had been out at first light that Sunday, around 5 in the morning. A stretch of his eastern fence had been broken through the previous night. He believed by a few head of cattle from the Dunmore Ranch to the north that had gotten loose. He had been following the fence line toward the dry creek bed when he found Clara's horse first, standing quietly in the sage about 50 yards from the creek. A saddled horse standing alone in the pre-dawn dark was wrong, and he had known it was wrong immediately. He had followed the reins and found her. She was lying at the bottom of the creek bank, which was perhaps a 6-foot drop. Her neck was broken. She had been dead for some hours, he judged by the cold of her skin and the state of things. Her hat was missing. Her riding gloves were in her coat pockets rather than on her hands. The horse showed no signs of injury or fright that would explain a fall. The stirrups were not broken, the saddle was not twisted, the ground at the top of the bank showed no signs of the horse shying or scrambling. He had picked her up himself, wrapped her in the horse blanket from his saddlebag, laid her across the horse and brought her back to town. The hat was never found. She was not wearing her gloves, Winifred said quietly. No. They were in her pockets, both pockets, one glove each. She always put her gloves away carefully. She was particular about her things. Winifred turned her coffee cup a slow half-circle on the table. She would not have ridden out at night with her gloves in her pockets. She would have been wearing them, and she would never have ridden east. Her boarding house was northwest of the schoolhouse. I know, Benjamin said. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who are thinking the same hard thought and giving it the respect it deserved before saying it aloud. Someone moved her there, Winifred said finally. That is what I believe, Benjamin said. I told Prout. He said there was no evidence to conclusively support that and that accidents happen. Did my sister have any trouble with anyone in this town? Any disagreements? Anyone who might have wished her harm? Benjamin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. There is a man named Dale Whitmore. He runs the biggest cattle operation in the county, comes in from his main ranch about 30 miles north once or twice a month. He had been paying attention to your sister in a way that she did not welcome. She told Mrs. Alcott about it. She had stopped walking home alone from the schoolhouse in the evenings because of it. Winifred felt something cold and definite settle into the center of her chest. And you told Prout this. I did. Whitmore is the biggest employer in the county and the largest depositor at the Harrows Creek Bank. His brother-in-law is a county judge. Benjamin's voice remained level, but his dark eyes held something that had been living behind them for a long time, something that looked like contained fury and something else that looked like grief. Prout is not a bad man, but he is a man who knows which way the wind blows. Winifred looked at him directly. You have been carrying this. It was not a question. He met her gaze, and something in the steadiness of her, the way she looked at him without flinching, without the particular kind of female distress that many men in that era might have used as a reason to slow down or redirect the conversation, seemed to reach him. Your sister was a good woman, he said, and his voice came out with a roughness at the edges that had not been there before. She taught my neighbor's children. She was kind to people. She did not deserve what happened to her, and she deserved better than what this town gave her afterward. Then help me, Winifred said. Help me find out what actually happened. He looked at her across the table for a long moment. The morning light was full now, coming through the east windows in golden sheets, catching the dust motes in the air between them and the steam rising from their coffee cups. Yes, he said simply. What followed were 2 weeks of careful, methodical inquiry that Winifred pursued with the focus of a woman who had turned her grief into something with edges and direction. She was not reckless about it. She had no legal standing in the territory, no official capacity, no powerful allies. What she had was determination, intelligence, a gift for asking questions in ways that did not alarm people, and Benjamin Cooper, who knew every person in that county and who opened doors for her in the patient, unhurried way he did everything. They rode together on most mornings. He would collect her from Mrs. Alcott's boarding house at 7 o'clock, and they would ride to whatever corner of the county held the next conversation to be had. And the rides there and back became their own private world of gradual understanding. They talked about Clara, naturally, and Winifred discovered through these conversations a version of her sister she had not entirely known. Clara, who had been brave and curious and had made friends quickly. Clara, who had argued passionately with the town council about extending the school term. Clara, who had a talent for finding the best of people and drawing it out. They also talked about other things. Winifred told him about growing up in Ohio, about the cold winters and the smell of the river, and the way the light was different there, softer and more diffuse, nothing like this relentless Western brilliance. Benjamin told her about coming to the territory from Missouri 10 years ago, about building the ranch from almost nothing, about the particular quality of silence in the desert at night that had frightened him at first, and then become the thing he loved most about the place. He was not a man who talked easily. She understood that. Each sentence he offered was deliberate and considered, and she found herself leaning toward them the way you lean toward a fire on a cold night. There was no performance in him, no showmanship, no effort to make himself larger than he was. He simply was what he was, and what he was turned out to be exactly the kind of man she had not expected to find in a small cattle town in New Mexico territory when she had come riding in full of grief and grim purpose. She noticed things about him in those first weeks that she noted to herself with a kind of private carefulness. The way he handled horses, with a gentleness so matter-of-fact it was clearly simply how he was rather than how he performed. The way he spoke to the Mexican ranch hands who worked for him, Louis and Octavio, with a directness and respect that was not universal among Anglo-ranchers of the time and territory. The scar along his left jaw that she was curious about but did not ask. The way he looked out at his land from his porch in the evening when she had stayed late talking, and the sun was going down, with an expression of such quiet contentment that it was almost startling on a face that otherwise carried so much weight. She also noticed that he watched her when he thought she was not looking, not in the way that Dale Whitmore had apparently watched Clara, not with anything predatory or possessive about it. With something more like attention, the way you watch a hawk riding thermals, because the watching itself is a kind of pleasure. She was not entirely unaware of what was happening between them. She simply had a reason to be in Harrow's Creek that was not about Benjamin Cooper, and she kept that reason at the forefront of everything she did. The break in the case, if it could be called that, came from an unexpected quarter. One of the Mexican families who lived on the eastern edge of town, the Reyes family, had a daughter named Esperanza who had been one of Clara's students. The girl was 14 and serious, and had adored Miss Merritt with the fierce devotion of a child who discovers in a teacher not just instruction but genuine recognition. Esperanza's mother, Dolores Reyes, had heard about Winifred through the small, efficient grapevine of the town's Mexican community, which operated largely beneath the notice of the Anglo establishment and kept its own counsel about the things it knew. Mrs. Reyes sent word through Louis, Benjamin's ranch hand, that she would be willing to speak with Winifred if Miss Merritt could come to the house on a Thursday evening when her husband was at work. They went together, Benjamin and Winifred, and sat in the Reyes' kitchen while Dolores Reyes poured them coffee with the formal hospitality of a woman who had something difficult to offer and needed the ritual to frame it properly. What Dolores Reyes had to offer was this. On the Friday evening that Clara had disappeared, her son Roberto, who was 17, had been coming home late along the eastern road after helping a friend mend a corral. He had seen Dale Whitmore's wagon, the one with the distinctive red wheel spoke on the left rear wheel that everyone in the county knew, parked just off the main road near the stand of cottonwood trees about half a mile east of town. This was around 9 in the evening. He had thought nothing of it at the time, but when he had heard later about where Miss Clara had been found, he had told his mother, and his mother had thought about it for 6 weeks before deciding that a woman's justice mattered more than the risk of angering Dale Whitmore. Winifred reached across the table and took Dolores Reyes's hand and held it for a moment without speaking. The weight of what the woman had risked in telling them sat in the room like something tangible. "Thank you," she said simply. They rode back to Benjamin's ranch in the dark, neither of them speaking much. The stars in the New Mexico desert are extraordinary in number and clarity, and the Milky Way was a broad river of light above them as they walked the horses along the ridge road. Winifred was thinking hard about what came next, about what a wagon parked in the cottonwoods on a Friday night actually proved, and what it did not prove, and how a woman with no official standing in the territory could possibly use it to accomplish anything. "Whitmore has a foreman named Granger," Benjamin said. "He has been with Whitmore for 12 years. There is a history between them that involves Whitmore being significantly in debt to Granger over a card game gone wrong. It has never been paid. Granger has never pushed it, but the debt exists and men like Granger remember debts." Winifred looked at him in the dark. "How do you know this?" "Lewis told me. Lewis's cousin worked on the Whitmore ranch for 3 years. There is not much that happens on that ranch that the workers do not know. And you think Granger might be willing to talk?" "I think Granger is a man who has been looking the other way for 12 years, which is a long time to look the other way, and I think the right conversation at the right moment might shift things." "What is the right conversation?" Benjamin was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily beneath them through the sage-scented dark. "One that makes him understand that what he knows matters, that there is a woman buried in that churchyard who had a family and a future and who was 22 years old. Not a legal argument, not a threat, a human argument." Winifred looked at him and felt something she was not quite ready to name move through her like a warm current. "You are a good man, Benjamin Cooper," she said quietly. He did not answer that directly. She could see in the starlight that something had moved through him too, some response he was containing with the characteristic careful restraint that was so essentially him. "Ride with me tomorrow morning," he said instead. "I know where Granger drinks." They found Granger at a roadhouse 6 miles north of town, a weathered man in his late 40s with a face like a geological event and eyes that had seen too much and made their peace with none of it. Benjamin went in first, alone, and talked to him for 20 minutes while Winifred waited outside with the horses and the wide afternoon sky. When Benjamin came out, he tilted his head toward the door and said, "He will talk to you." What Granger told her, sitting across from her in a dim roadhouse booth with his hat in his hands and a whiskey he did not drink sitting in front of him, was that on the night Clara went missing, he had been returning to the Whitmore ranch with a supply wagon and had passed his employer's wagon parked in the cottonwoods just as Roberto Reyes had said. He had seen Dale Whitmore get down from the wagon and walk toward the creek bed with something over his shoulder. He had not stopped. He had told himself it was none of his business. He had told himself this every day since. He was not a man of great courage. He said so himself without apparent self-pity, just as a statement of fact. But he was a man who had been sleeping badly for nearly 2 months, and when Benjamin Cooper had sat down across from him and told him quietly about Clara Merritt and her sister who had come from Denver to find the truth, something had shifted in the architecture of his accommodation. He would sign a statement. He would not go to Pruitt with it. He would go to the U.S. Marshal's office in Santa Fe. Winifred wrote the statement herself, sitting at the roadhouse bar with paper and pencil while Granger sat beside her, and she read each sentence back to him, and he nodded and added or adjusted as needed. She wrote it in plain language, in the factual and specific way her own schoolteacher in Ohio had taught her to write, and when it was done Granger signed it in a large, uncertain hand, and she folded it carefully and placed it inside her coat, against her heart. Sending word to the U.S. Marshal's office took another week and a half. The response, when it came, was measured but definitive. A deputy marshal named Ellison would arrive in Harrow's Creek within the month. He would look into the matter. In the meantime, they were advised to be discreet. Winifred had been in Harrow's Creek for nearly 3 weeks by the time all of this was in motion, and she had made a decision at some point during those 3 weeks, so gradual that she could not identify exactly when it had been made, that she was no longer in a particular hurry to leave. It was Benjamin who named what was happening between them, which surprised her, because he was not a man who moved toward difficult conversations. But he was also, she had discovered, a man who believed in honesty with a kind of bedrock conviction, a man who thought that the truth, spoken plainly and without performance, was a form of respect. It was a Sunday evening. She had come out to the ranch for dinner, which had become a routine over the past week and a half, the two of them sitting at his rough-hewn table with food and coffee, and the easy silence of people who have stopped needing to fill the quiet between them. After dinner, they had sat on the porch and watched the sunset paint the desert in colors so extravagant they seemed almost invented, deep orange and rose, and a peculiar shade of violet that Winifred had never seen in any sky over Ohio. When the light had finally gone and the first stars were appearing, he turned to look at her directly and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need to say it plainly, because I think that is what you deserve." She turned to face him, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serious and open. "I did not know what to do with myself after I found your sister," he said. "I have been to war, I have seen men die, I have had difficult things happen in my life, but finding her in that creek bed, and knowing that what happened to her was wrong and not being able to make it right, that has sat on me like a stone for 2 months. And then you rode up to my fence line, and you looked at me with those gray eyes, and you did not ask me to make it easier or to soften it. You just asked me to tell you the truth, and something in me that had been locked up tight since that Sunday morning came loose." He paused and looked out at the darkening desert, gathering the next part. "I am 31 years old, and I have not been close to a woman since a situation 6 years ago in Missouri that I will tell you about someday if you want to know it. And I did not expect to find myself in this particular moment. But I think I would be doing both of us a disservice if I pretended that what has been growing here is nothing, or if I let you leave Harrow's Creek thinking that you were only ever a woman who came to ask me questions." The stars were fully out now. A coyote called somewhere out in the sage, long and quavering. Winifred sat very still for a moment, feeling the particular warmth of hearing something true said out loud. "I think I have been pretending the same thing," she said carefully, "for approximately 12 days. Something happened in his face then, a slow loosening, like the particular way ice sounds when it begins to give way in the first warmth of spring." "What would you do," he asked, "if you stayed? What would you do with yourself in a small cattle town in the New Mexico territory when you have spent your life in cities?" It was such a practical question, and she found she loved him a little for it, for the fact that his first thought was not about himself but about her. "I would find something useful," she said. "I always have." He reached out then, deliberate and careful as everything he did, and covered both her hands with one of his. His hand was large and roughened and warm, and she turned her palm up beneath it and held on. They stayed on the porch for another hour, talking quietly, and when she finally rode back to town, she was aware of carrying something new and fragile and completely unexpected back with her through the starlit desert, like finding a wildflower growing in the crack of a dry red rock and understanding, without being able to fully explain why, that it was exactly where it was supposed to be. The deputy marshal arrived on a Wednesday, 17 days after they had sent word. His name was Ellison, and he was a compact, professional man in his 40s who wore his authority lightly and listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to sorting truth from rumor in difficult circumstances. Winifred met with him first, laid out everything they had with the precision and orderliness of someone who had been building a case in her mind for weeks. She showed him the statement from Granger, the evidence about the gloves and the hat, the testimony about Clara's avoidance of Whitmore's attentions, the witness account from Roberto Reyes. Ellison read everything twice, asked questions, made notes in a small journal. "You have done careful work," he said. "My sister deserved careful work," Winifred said. Ellison took statements from Granger and from Dolores Reyes and her son Roberto. He rode out to the creek bed and spent 2 hours there. He spoke with Prout, who was, by this point, a man very much aware that he had underperformed, and who cooperated with the federal officer with the energy of someone hoping to limit the consequences. Dale Whitmore was arrested on a Saturday morning, 11 days after Ellison's arrival, at his ranch 30 miles north. He protested loudly and with the particular outrage of a man accustomed to his community's deference, but the weight of the evidence, and the authority of the federal marshal's office, and the presence of a deputy who had not grown up in the shadow of Whitmore's influence, and so had no particular reason to accommodate it, moved forward without being deflected. It did not bring Clara back. Nothing would bring Clara back. Winifred stood at the grave in the small church cemetery with its simple wooden marker and the yellow wildflowers she had brought from the desert, and she wept for the first time since receiving the telegram. She wept with her hand pressed flat against the warm earth, and her forehead bowed and her whole body shaking with the force of the grief she had been holding at careful arm's length for 6 weeks in order to be useful. Benjamin was there. He stood a few feet back and gave her the privacy of it, but he was there, and when she finally stood up and turned around, red-eyed and emptied out, he was simply present in the way that he was always present, solid and steady and asking nothing. And she walked forward and he put his arms around her and she pressed her face against his chest and let him hold her while the desert wind moved through the graveyard grass. "I'm going to make sure she has a proper stone," she said when she had found her voice again, "with her name and the dates and something that is true about her. We will find a stonecutter in Santa Fe," he said. "I will take you." She looked up at him with her tear-streaked face and the late afternoon light behind him and said, "You keep saying we." "I have noticed that," he said with the ghost of something that was almost a smile. They went to Santa Fe, the two of them, the following week. It was a 2-day journey by horse, and they stopped overnight at a way station where the proprietor made no unkind assumptions about them, and offered them 2 separate rooms and a dinner of roasted mutton. That was the best thing Winifred had eaten since leaving Denver. They rode through landscapes of such arresting beauty that Winifred found herself stopping frequently to simply look, the way you stop mid-sentence when you realize something important, and Benjamin would stop beside her without impatience and look too, and she began to understand that this shared capacity for stillness, for being willing to simply be present to something without immediately processing and moving on, was one of the things that made being with him feel like rest. In Santa Fe they found a stonecutter, a Mexican craftsman named Señor Gallegos, who had beautiful lettering and who listened to Winifred describe her sister with the attention and gravity of an artist receiving a commission. On the stone, below Clara's name and her dates, Winifred had him carve. She was brave and curious and kind, and she opened the world to children. It was not poetry, but it was true, and it would stand. They also spent 2 days in Santa Fe seeing to the formal legal proceedings with the federal court, where Winifred gave a full sworn statement and was told by the court clerk that the case against Dale Whitmore was substantial and that the trial would take place in the autumn. She was given a date and a contact name and told that her presence in the fall would be appreciated. She had not yet fully decided whether she was staying, but the decision was moving in a particular direction. On the evening before they rode back to Harrow's Creek, they sat in a small courtyard behind the inn where they were staying, a shaded adobe space with a fountain that made a continuous soft sound in the still evening, and they talked for a long time about what came next. Not only about the trial, but about everything, about what a life might look like. "I have been thinking about the school," Winifred said. "Clara's position has not been filled. The children have a substitute who comes twice a week, but there is no full teacher." Benjamin looked at her carefully. "Can you teach?" "I have 3 years of education beyond what was required. I taught at a dame school in Denver for a year before I found other employment. Yes, I can teach." "And would it be enough for you?" She considered this seriously, turning her coffee cup in her hands. Teaching is not a small thing, she said finally. What Clara was doing was not a small thing. She was giving those children the tools to think and to read and to understand more of the world than Harrow's Creek might otherwise show them. I think I would find that more than enough. He was looking at her with that expression she had come to recognize over the past weeks, the one that he wore when he was feeling something that his habitual restraint was not quite large enough to fully contain. I would like you to stay, he said, not only because of the school, because I have gotten used to you being there. You have gotten used to me being there, she repeated, with a slight lift at the corner of her mouth. That is a rather understated way to put it. I am an understated man. You are. I would very much like you to stay, he said again, with a quieter emphasis, and this time there was nothing understated about it. She reached across the small courtyard table and touched his face, the strong line of his jaw, the scar she had been curious about since the first day. He went very still beneath her hand, the way he went still when something reached him. Tell me about this, she said gently, tracing the scar. A knife fight in a saloon in Albuquerque, he said. I was 23 and I had very poor judgment about which arguments were worth having. The other man looked worse, if that is any comfort. She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed, a real and unguarded laugh since Denver, and the sound of it seemed to surprise both of them. It surprised her because she had not known she still had it in her, that particular lightness, and it seemed to surprise him because he watched it happen with an expression of such unguarded warmth that she felt the full weight of it somewhere deep in her chest. Stay, he said, very simply. Yes, she said, I will stay. They rode back to Harrow's Creek the following morning in the early light, and the desert was magnificent around them, gold and red and the particular blue of a southwestern sky in late spring, and Winifred Merritt felt something she had not expected to feel in this territory that had taken her sister. She felt, with a quiet and undeniable certainty, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. There were practical matters to attend to. There always are. She wrote to Denver to have the rest of her belongings sent, a modest trunk and a box of books that arrived 6 weeks later with only one volume of Dickens cracked along the spine from the journey. She applied formally for Clara's teaching position and was hired by the town school board after a meeting that was awkward on both sides but ultimately productive. Mrs. Alcott, who had by this point understood the general direction of things, helped her find a small house to rent on the western edge of town, 2 rooms and a kitchen with a good stove, and a patch of garden in the back where she immediately planted beans and tomatoes with seeds she bought from the general store. Benjamin continued to come to town regularly, but the nature of the visits shifted. They had dinner together in the evenings, sometimes at Mrs. Alcott's, sometimes at Winifred's small house, sometimes at the ranch. They rode together on Sunday mornings. They talked about everything, the kind of everything that builds between two people who have decided, without quite saying it yet in formal terms, that their futures are going to be shared. He was courting her in the way that a serious man courts, without fanfare but with consistency and attention, appearing reliably at the moments when reliability mattered, listening when she talked about her days at the school with the genuine interest of a man who found her mind attractive, bringing her small things without ceremony, a handful of wildflowers left on her porch, a book he thought she might not have read, a jar of honey from the beekeeper on the Ridge Road, because she had mentioned once in passing that she had not tasted decent honey since Ohio. She loved him for these things with a love that was building itself solidly and without rush, like a good wall laid with careful hands. The school reopened in the first week of September with Winifred at the front of the room and 18 students arrayed before her on wooden benches, ranging in age from 6 to 14. They looked at her with the cautious assessment of children measuring a new authority figure, and she looked back at them with the directness and warmth that had always been her particular gift. And by the end of the first day, she had learned all 18 names and had made 3 of them laugh, and had earned the particular fierce allegiance of one very serious 7-year-old boy named Thomas, who had not previously enjoyed school, and who told his mother that evening that the new teacher was different. Esperanza Reyes came to her after school on the third day, and stood in the doorway with her dark, serious eyes and her hands folded in front of her and said, "Miss Merritt, are you going to stay?" "Yes," Winifred said. "I am going to stay." The girl nodded once with a gravity that held something of relief in it, and then came inside and helped Winifred organize the bookshelf, and they worked together in companionable silence until the late afternoon light came through the schoolhouse windows at that particular slant that meant the day was nearly over. The trial of Dale Whitmore took place in October in Santa Fe, as scheduled. Winifred rode down for it with Benjamin and with Deputy Marshal Ellison, who had remained in the territory to see the matter through. Granger testified. Roberto Reyes testified. Winifred gave her statement with the steadiness that those who knew her had come to expect, looking directly at Dale Whitmore when she spoke about her sister, not with hatred but with a clarity that was perhaps more powerful, a refusal to let him be reduced to an abstraction or a legal matter. He was a man who had done a thing, and Clara had been a woman, and the woman had mattered. Whitmore was convicted of second-degree murder. He received a sentence of 20 years in the federal penitentiary in Kansas. His ranch would ultimately be broken up and sold, the workers absorbed by other operations in the county. The county judge, who was his brother-in-law, chose not to stand for re-election the following spring. Winifred stood outside the courthouse in the autumn Santa Fe sunshine and breathed very carefully and deliberately for several seconds, feeling something that was not happiness exactly, because justice is not happiness, but was a kind of completion, a sense of a promise kept. Benjamin stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, not speaking. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not looking the other way when you found her. For telling the truth to Prout even knowing it would not be acted on. For being a man worth finding when I rode up to your fence line." He turned to look at her then, and the autumn light was on both their faces, and he said, "Winifred, marry me." She had known it was coming, and had still managed to catch her somewhere behind the sternum, the directness of it, the simplicity, no preamble, no elaborate arrangement, just the facts stated as clearly as everything else he ever said. "You are asking me on the courthouse steps in Santa Fe," she said. "I am. After a murder trial." "Yes." "That is very like you," she said, and the warmth in her voice made him look at her with that particular unguarded expression that she had come to think of as the truest version of his face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married in December, in the small church in Harrows Creek, with the crooked steeple, and the minister who had known Clara and who spoke about her briefly and warmly at the beginning of the ceremony, which Winifred had requested, and which made the whole thing feel like what it was, not a departure from the purpose that had brought her to the territory, but a continuation of it. Mrs. Alcott was there, and Dolers and Roberto and Esperanza Reyes, and Louis and Octavio from the ranch, and several of Winifred's students who had been allowed to attend by their parents, and Thomas, the serious 7-year-old, who wore a clean shirt and stood very straight and told anyone within range that his teacher was getting married, and that Mr. Cooper was, in his assessment, acceptable. Benjamin wore a dark suit he had clearly made for the occasion, and looked like a man who had never been more serious about anything in his life, which was saying something for a man of that quality of seriousness. He stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him, and something moved through his face that Winifred knew she would remember until she was very old, a look of such direct and unperformative love that it was almost like a hand placed over her heart. She wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that she had brought from Denver, and she carried yellow wildflowers, the ones that grew in the desert that had seemed to her, from the very first time she had seen them, to be brave things. She was brave, too. She was in the right place. They said their vows in plain language, adding one sentence to the traditional form at Winifred's suggestion. After the minister said the words about love and honor and keeping, she asked to add, And in honesty, always in honesty. The minister agreed and added it for both of them, and Benjamin said it looking directly at her with the eyes that had been looking at her honestly from the very first morning at the fence line. They had a celebration at Mrs. Alcott's boarding house afterward, which had been temporarily transformed by an enthusiasm of paper decorations, and the best cooking the widow could produce. And there was music from two men with a fiddle and a guitar who played until the stars were well up, and the younger children had fallen asleep on their parents' laps, and Winifred danced with her husband on the boarding house porch, while the desert night surrounded them in its enormous and star-filled silence. She had not expected to dance on any night in Harrows Creek, New Mexico territory. She had come here with grief and purpose and nothing else. And here she was, turning in the arms of a serious and good man on a porch under the southwestern stars, alive to the fact that life had a way of making something out of the most terrible foundations if you were willing to keep walking into it. They moved into the ranch that winter, Winifred and all her books and her box of Dickens, with the cracked spine and her seeds and her teaching materials. The house was already clean and orderly, but she made it home in the way that only people who know what home should feel like can do, adding a rag rug she had braided herself to the front room floor, putting curtains on the east windows that caught the morning light, planting a second garden that would in the spring grow the herbs she needed for cooking, and the particular zinnias that reminded her of her mother's garden in Ohio. They were good together in the particular way of people whose rhythms and natures had oriented toward each other. He woke early and she woke early. He worked quietly and she worked quietly. They were both readers, and they spent evenings on opposite sides of the fireplace with books and coffee, and the sound of the wind off the desert, and the occasional distant coyote making the kind of music that the territory reserved for people who had learned to hear it as music rather than threat. He was generous with her in the ways that matter, with his time and his honesty and his full attention. She was generous with him in the ways that he had needed without quite knowing it, the warmth she brought to the house and the directness with which she named what she felt and the way she made him laugh, which she did more often than he had expected, because she was funny when she chose to be, in a dry and precise way that caught him every time. She continued to teach. This was not a question between them. She loved the work with a devotion that he respected and admired, and he told her so, which she appreciated because she was not a woman who needed to be told, but it was good to be seen clearly. The school grew during her second year. 4 new students added as families in the county heard that Harrows Creek had a real teacher now, one who was serious about what she was doing. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography and a rudimentary understanding of natural history, and she argued successfully with the school board for a supply of proper books, and she taught her students how to ask questions, which she considered the most important thing she could give them. Esperanza Reyes, by Winifred's second year, had become genuinely exceptional, the kind of student who arrives once in a generation, and Winifred began corresponding with the Sisters of Loretto in Santa Fe on the girl's behalf, because she had determined that Esperanza would have access to the kind of secondary education that her talent warranted, and she was willing to write as many letters as it took to make that happen. In the spring of 1885, Winifred discovered that she was expecting a child. She told Benjamin on a Sunday morning when they were sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee, and the east windows were full of the new spring light that came across the desert in late April like something being poured. She told him simply and directly, in the way she told him everything, and watched his face with the private pleasure of knowing his face well enough now to read it. He was quiet for a moment, which she expected, and then he put down his coffee cup and reached across the table and covered her hands with both of his, and looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between the look he wore when he was feeling more than his restraint could fully contain and something new, something she had not seen before, a kind of awe. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said, which made her smile because of course that was the first thing. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said. And then, quietly, "Good." He was attentive through the pregnancy in the practical and unobtrusive way that characterized everything he did. He did not treat her as an invalid, which she would have found insulting, but he adjusted things without commentary, taking the heavier work at the ranch without drawing attention to the adjustment, ensuring that the horse she rode on their Sunday mornings was the steadiest and most reliable one, adding a second chair to the kitchen corner that had better light for reading, because she was spending more evenings sitting down. She continued teaching until July, when the heat made the schoolhouse genuinely untenable, and the summer session broke anyway. She spent the long, hot summer afternoons in the cooler back room of the house with her books and her needlework, and occasionally, Benjamin, who had developed a habit during the summer heat of taking an hour in the afternoon to sit with her, which she knew was partly to keep her company, and partly because he was, beneath the practical rancher exterior, a man who would have been quite content to spend significant portions of his day simply being near her. She did not tell him this. She let him maintain the fiction that he was resting his back, which bothered him occasionally after a working morning, and found the whole arrangement deeply satisfying. Their son was born in October, in the year 1885, on a night of extraordinary stars. They named him James William Cooper, James for Benjamin's father and William for Winifred's, two men who had never met and never would, but whose names now lived together in a child who came into the world already equipped with his father's dark eyes, and what Benjamin claimed was his mother's expression of fierce assessment. He was a vigorous and opinionated infant who made his views known loudly and frequently, and who was, from the first weeks of his life, very clearly going to be exactly like Winifred in matters of determination. Benjamin held him on the first evening with the same careful and deliberate attention he brought to everything, sitting in the chair by the fireplace with the baby against his chest, and looked at his son with an expression so completely open that Winifred, watching from the bed, had to turn her face away for a moment because the sight of it was almost too much. She had come to this territory with nothing but grief and a telegram. She looked at the man sitting by her fireplace holding their son and felt the full improbable weight of what had grown from that, and she let herself feel it completely, without reservation or apology. James was a fine boy who grew quickly and noisily, and with great enthusiasm for horses, which pleased his father enormously, and an equally great enthusiasm for the books his mother kept stacking on his particular shelf in the schoolroom, which he attended from the age of 5, with the resigned acceptance of a child who has understood that his mother's school is not something he is going to negotiate his way out of. He was bright and social and made friends with an ease that reminded Winifred of Clara, which she told Benjamin on a quiet evening when James was 2 years old, and Benjamin had looked at her with understanding and said, she would have loved him, and Winifred had said, yes. She would have loved both of you, and they had sat with that for a while in the good and comfortable silence of people who have learned how to carry their losses together. In the spring of 1887, when James was a year and a half old and had recently discovered the capacity for locomotion and was applying it with unreasonable speed and creativity, Winifred found she was expecting again. This one arrived in December of that year, a daughter they named Clara Rose Cooper, the first name for the woman under the yellow wildflowers in the church cemetery, and the second name because she came into the world in the month when the rosebush Winifred had planted along the porch was still showing its last stubborn red bloom against the desert cold. Clara Rose was, from the beginning, her father's child in temperament, quiet and serious and watchful, with her mother's gray eyes and a way of looking at the world that suggested she was cataloging it for future reference. She attached herself early to the ranch horses with a devotion that her parents found both charming and logistically challenging, and by the time she could walk reliably, she had taken to following Louis around the stable with the focused attention of a professional apprentice. The naming of Clara Rose had been something Benjamin had suggested gently, and Winifred had held the idea for a full day before accepting it, turning it over carefully in the private space where she still tended to the grief of her sister. She had decided that the name was right, not because grief should be erased or replaced, but because carrying it forward in the form of a living child, who would herself be brave and curious, and kind, seemed exactly like the right kind of continuation. She visited the grave on Clara's birthday every year, in February, bringing the yellow wildflowers when she could find them and the zinnias she grew in her garden in the summer. She had started bringing James once he was old enough to understand where they were going, telling him about the woman who had come west with a trunk full of good dresses and a love of learning, and who had opened the world to the children of Harrow's Creek before the world closed on her too soon. Benjamin always came with her. He had found her there, in a sense, in the dry creek bed in the pre-dawn dark, and he came to the grave with a respect that was not guilt but was something deeper, a sense of permanent connection to the woman who had led him, improbably and roundaboutly, to everything that mattered most in his life. The years passed in the way of years in the territory, each one marked by the particular events of working land and raising children and living inside a marriage that had been built on honesty and continued to be maintained by it. The ranch grew modestly and steadily, Benjamin adding a second corral, and then a third, and developing a reputation in the county for horses of particular quality, which brought buyers from as far as Albuquerque. Louis and Octavio both stayed on, and both eventually brought families to the small houses on the ranch property, and the Cooper Ranch became a compound of sorts, a small world that functioned on cooperation and mutual respect in a territory where the relationships between Anglo ranchers and their Mexican workers were not always characterized by either. Winifred's school grew too. By 1889, she had 28 students and had successfully lobbied the county for a second teacher, a young woman from Missouri named Frances Harker, who arrived with excellent credentials and a practical temperament, and who became, within the first year, both a valued colleague and a genuine friend. Frances introduced Winifred to the idea of corresponding with the newly established New Mexico Territorial Education Office, and the two of them together pushed for curriculum improvements and material support, and an expanded school term with the combined determination of women who had decided that the children of Harrow's Creek deserved better than a frontier minimum. They largely succeeded. Not always quickly, and not always without frustration, but they succeeded. Esperanza Reyes had been accepted to the Loreto Academy in Santa Fe in 1887, and had returned to Harrow's Creek 3 years later as a teacher herself, the youngest on any faculty in the county, and had come to Winifred's house on her first evening back to sit at the kitchen table and drink coffee and be told that she was brilliant, and that Miss Merritt, now Mrs. Cooper, was proud of her in the specific and complete way of a teacher who has seen what she hoped for come to pass. "You should have seen yourself when you came to my classroom," Winifred told her, so serious, standing in the doorway asking if I was going to stay. "I needed to know," Esperanza said without apology. "You always need to know," Winifred said. "It has always been one of your best qualities." Benjamin came in from the ranch while they were still talking and poured himself coffee and sat down and listened to the two of them with the quiet attention he brought to everything. And when Esperanza had gone and the house was evening quiet except for the sound of the children settling, he came and stood behind Winifred's chair and put his hands on her shoulders. "You are doing what she did," he said. "What Clara did." She put her hands over his and leaned back against him. "That was the intention," she said. In 1889, New Mexico was still a territory, still waiting for statehood that would not come until 1912. The politics of the place were complicated, and the injustices visible to anyone who was willing to look. The treatment of the Mexican population, the treatment of the Apache and Navajo whose land this had been, and whose relationship with the new order was one of constant and painful negotiation. The ways in which the law was applied with a discretion that corresponded closely to wealth and connections, and the color of one's skin. Winifred taught all of this to her students in the careful and clear-eyed way she taught everything, because she believed that children who understood the world they were living in had a better chance of making it different. Benjamin did not carry a badge and was not a political man in any formal sense, but he was the kind of man who did the right thing in the specific and immediate ways available to him, which she had understood about him from the first morning at the fence line. He employed fairly and paid fairly and treated people as people, and in a county where the Whitmore operation had set a certain tone for decades, the Cooper Ranch's reputation as a place where a man's work was valued without qualification became its own quiet statement. They argued sometimes, as people who think seriously about things are bound to do when they think differently about the same thing. He was more cautious than she was by nature, more inclined to work within existing structures because he had a rancher's practical understanding of what could and could not be accomplished by opposition. She was more inclined to push, sometimes farther and faster than was strategically wise. They had a memorable argument in the summer of 1889 about whether she should confront the county school board directly over their refusal to hire a Mexican teacher for the lower grades, an argument that lasted 3 evenings and was conducted with complete respect and considerable heat, and ended with Benjamin conceding that she was right about the principle and Winifred conceding that he was right about the approach. And the two of them together designing a strategy that was more likely to actually work. The county school board hired Esperanza Reyes for the lower grades the following spring. There were other arguments and other resolutions, and the pattern of them was always the same: two serious people taking each other seriously, neither one capitulating when they believed themselves right and both willing to be changed by a genuinely good argument. It was, Winifred had come to think, the most honest form of love she had ever encountered, the love that does not smooth everything into agreement but holds the disagreement within a frame of permanent commitment. She was reading by the fireplace on a December evening in 1890, when James was 5 and Clara Rose 3, and both children were in bed, and the ranch was deep in the winter quiet that she had come to love as much as Benjamin said he did, when she looked up and found him watching her from the doorway with that particular expression. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I was thinking that you are the most remarkable thing that has ever happened in my life," he said. She put down her book. "That is the most extravagant thing you have ever said. I have been saving it," he said. She laughed, and he crossed the room and sat beside her on the rug in front of the fireplace, the way he sometimes did when the evening was cold and the fire was high, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the fire made its comfortable sounds, and outside the desert was silver with cold moonlight. "I came here to find answers," she said after a while. "I know. I found considerably more than answers." "I am aware," he said, and she could hear the smile in it, the quiet and contained pleasure that was his particular form of happiness. She turned to look at his face in the firelight, the familiar and beloved face with its geography of weather and work, and the scar along his jaw that she had traced with her fingers 100 times now. And she thought about the woman she had been when she stepped off the stagecoach in Harrow's Creek with her carpet bag and her grief and her purpose, and about the distance between that woman and this one, not a distance of change exactly but of addition. Everything she had been still intact, and everything she had found here added to it like rooms added to a house that was already standing. "Benjamin," she said, "yes. Are you happy?" He considered this in the way he considered everything, with the full attention it deserved, and then he turned and looked at her with eyes that held no performance and no reservation, only the direct and settled truth. "Completely," he said. She kissed him then, the way she kissed him when she wanted him to understand that the word was the right one, and she was glad he had said it. And the fire snapped, and the desert moon moved slowly through the window frame, and the children slept in their beds, and outside the coyotes were singing to the cold sky in the ancient way of the territory. The night Clara had been found in the Dry Creek bed, Benjamin had stood at the edge of it in the gray pre-dawn light with the weight of something terrible in his arms, and had felt the specific and crushing helplessness of a good man faced with a wrong he had not caused and could not entirely repair. He had carried that weight through the months that followed, through the indifference of the sheriff's office and the invulnerability of powerful men, and the silence of a town that was not evil but was tired and afraid. And then a woman with gray eyes and a carpet bag and a set jaw had ridden up to his fence line and asked him to tell her the truth, and the weight had found a place to go. He thought about this sometimes, about the strange and particular mercy of it, the way that grief and purpose had arrived together in the form of this woman, and had made something from what might have remained only a wound. He was not a sentimental man, not given to grand pronouncements about fate or providence. But he believed, in the practical and quiet way he believed most things, that some meetings are right in a way that is not explained by coincidence. He believed this one had been right. In the spring of 1892, when James was 6 and Clara Rose 4 and the ranch was running well, and the school had 31 students and a proper curriculum and 2 good teachers, Winifred discovered for the 3rd time that she was expecting. She told Benjamin in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, again with the east windows full of spring light, and he looked at her with that expression of awe that had not diminished across 7 years of marriage. "How do you feel?" He asked first, as he always did. "Extremely well," she said, "better than either of the others, actually." The 3rd child arrived in November of 1892, a boy they named Henry Thomas Cooper. Henry for Benjamin's older brother in Missouri, Thomas for the serious 7-year-old who had grown up and gone on to work as a surveyor in Albuquerque, and who had written a letter to Winifred the previous Christmas that made her cry in the good way, the way of things fulfilled. Henry Thomas arrived with his mother's dark hair and a pair of lungs that expressed themselves with great conviction, and within his first weeks made clear that he was going to be, of the 3 Cooper children, the most immediately and physically adventurous. James, at 6, received the baby with the serious authority of an eldest child who has been briefed on the situation and considers himself prepared. Clara Rose, at 4, received him with a scrutiny that suggested she was not yet certain he would prove worth the reorganization of their household. By the time Henry was 3 months old and capable of interacting with her, she had decided he was acceptable, which from Clara Rose was a warm endorsement. The household in those years was a particular kind of beautiful chaos that Benjamin and Winifred navigated with the same combination of coordination and good humor that characterized their partnership in all things. He handled the ranch and the animals and the 1,000 practical matters of keeping a working property going in a territory that was still in many ways frontier, and she handled the school and the children's education and the correspondence and the household with the same organized intelligence she brought to everything. They helped each other in the way of people who have divided labor practically, without having made it a statement about who each person was, trading tasks without hierarchy when the need arose, sitting down together in the evenings to talk through the days and the plans and the problems and the pleasures. By the mid-1890s, Harrow's Creek had grown to a town of nearly 800 people, which was still small by Eastern standards, but represented a significant transformation from the 300 souls who had been there when Winifred stepped off the stagecoach. A proper hotel had replaced Mrs. Alcott's boarding house, which Mrs. Alcott had sold when her knees gave out, and she retired to a small house on the south end of town, where she kept an enormous kitchen garden and received visitors with a proprietary satisfaction. A newspaper had started, 4 pages printed on a press brought in from Albuquerque. The church had been rebuilt with a straight steeple. A doctor had arrived and stayed. The territory was changing. Some of the changes were good and some were not, and the ones that were not were usually still the same old injustices wearing new arrangements. Winifred wrote letters to the Territorial Education Office and the newspapers, and occasionally to the U.S. Congress, letters that were precise and evidenced and uncomfortable to receive, about the quality of education available to the Mexican and native children of the county, and the ways in which funding and curriculum and basic dignity were not equitably distributed. She did not expect rapid results from these letters. She sent them anyway. Benjamin read drafts of them at the kitchen table and occasionally suggested a different word and almost always said at the end that the letter was good and that she should send it. Clara Merritt's grave had a proper stone by now, the one Señor Gallegos had carved in Santa Fe in the summer of 1883, its letters still clean and deep nearly 15 years later. The yellow wildflowers came every February. James had started coming of his own accord by the time he was 8, and Clara Rose came too, with the seriousness she brought to everything that mattered. Henry was old enough now to come, and to understand that the stone marked the woman for whom his sister was named, and to stand respectfully while his mother spoke quietly to the grave about the year, about the school, about the children. Winifred had never stopped talking to Clara. She had found over the years that this was not a sign of unresolved grief, but of ongoing love, the particular kind of love that does not require its object to be present in order to be real. She told Clara about the trial and the verdict and the stone. She told her about Benjamin, the first time she had brought Clara Rose to the grave, holding the infant in her arms and saying, "This is Clara Rose. She has your name because you deserve to have something continue." She told her about the school and Esperanza and the 31 students and the letters to the Territorial Education Office and all the things that were built on the foundation of what Clara had started. She told her about the life that had grown from loss. On the evening of their 15th wedding anniversary, in December of 1898, Benjamin and Winifred sat on the porch of the ranch house after the children had gone to bed. James was 13 now, with his father's build and his mother's opinions. Clara Rose was 11, already extraordinary, already earmarked in Winifred's careful planning for an education that would take her places the territory could not contain. Henry was 6, golden-haired and perpetually in motion, currently in bed under protest. The December sky over the desert was vast and luminous, the stars as numerous as always, undimmed by the 15 years that had passed beneath them. 15 years, Winifred said. Yes. You found her in February of 1883. I arrived in April. We married in December. I know the dates, he said, with that quiet, particular warmth. I have been thinking about what I would have told myself. That April. The woman who got off the stagecoach. What would you have told her? She thought about it seriously, as she did everything. The wind came off the desert with its smell of sage and cold, the smell she had first registered as foreign and had long since come to know as home. I would have told her that she was right to come, she said, that the answers were here, all of them, more than she was looking for. He turned to look at her in the dark, and she knew his face well enough to know that the look was exactly what she thought it was. I would have told her to stay, she said, very simply, and she reached out her hand and he took it, as he had taken it every night for 15 years with the same deliberate care as the first time. The desert spread around them in the dark, magnificent and indifferent and beautiful, the territory that had taken Clara and given her back in ways she could not have imagined. And Benjamin Cooper held his wife's hand on the porch of the home they had built together from the most unlikely of beginnings, and the stars poured down on all of it. On the grave with the yellow wildflowers and the school with its 31 students and the 3 dark-haired children asleep inside and the whole improbable and hard-won life, and the night was full and quiet and complete. The coyotes sang to the cold sky. The moon moved through the stars. And Winifred Merritt, who had come west with nothing but grief and a purpose and a gray-eyed steadiness that would not be turned aside, who had found the truth and a man and a home, and a life in the most unexpected order, leaned her head against her husband's shoulder in the December dark, and breathed the sage-scented air of the territory, and was, entirely and without reservation, exactly where she was supposed to be.